What you're about to hear is a story that defies every logical explanation. In November of 1930, a seasoned fur trapper named Joe LaBelle was making his way across the frozen Canadian wilderness when he stumbled upon something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. An entire village had simply vanished. Not one person, not a family. An entire community of over 1,200 souls had disappeared without a trace. Lake Angikuni sits in the remote Kivalik region of what is now Nunavut, hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement. The lake itself stretches over 300 square kilometers of pristine Arctic wilderness, surrounded by endless tundra that can reach temperatures of minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. For generations, this had been home to a thriving Inuit community that had survived and prospered in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. Joe LaBelle knew this village well. He had been trading with these people for years, exchanging manufactured goods for furs and other Arctic provisions. The community was led by experienced hunters and elders who had intimate knowledge of the land passed down through countless generations. These were not people who would abandon their homes lightly, and they certainly weren't people who would disappear without leaving some indication of where they had gone. As LaBelle approached the village that November day, something felt wrong. The usual sounds were missing. No dogs barking, no children playing, no smoke rising from the traditional heating fires that would normally be burning constantly during the harsh Arctic winter. What he found when he entered the settlement would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about missing persons cases. The scene was eerily preserved, as if the entire population had simply evaporated mid-activity. Cooking pots still hung over cold fire pits, some containing food that had long since frozen solid. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the dwellings exactly as they had been left. Kayaks and other watercraft remained properly stored, indicating this was not a planned seasonal migration. Most disturbing of all, the community's sled dogs were found dead, still tethered to their posts, having apparently starved to death while waiting for masters who would never return. LaBelle immediately recognized that this was no ordinary abandonment. In his years of traveling the Arctic wilderness, he had seen communities relocate for various reasons, following game migrations, avoiding harsh weather, or joining other family groups. But those departures always involved taking essential supplies, freeing the dogs, and leaving some indication of their intended destination. This was different. This looked as though over 1,000 people had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routines. The fur trapper wasted no time in reporting his discovery to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The RCMP took the report seriously, dispatching investigators to the remote location despite the significant logistical challenges of reaching Lake Angikuni during the Arctic winter. What they found confirmed LaBelle's account and raised even more troubling questions. The official police investigation, led by experienced officers familiar with Arctic conditions, documented a scene that defied conventional explanation. The investigators confirmed that the village showed no signs of violence, no evidence of struggle, and no indication that the residents had packed for departure. Most significantly, they found no bodies, no graves, and no evidence that anyone had died in the settlement. The RCMP officers were particularly puzzled by the condition of the sled dogs. These animals were essential to Arctic survival, more valuable than almost any other possession in the harsh northern climate. The idea that an entire community would abandon their dogs to starve was almost inconceivable. Sled dogs were not just transportation, they were often the difference between life and death in the unforgiving Arctic wilderness. As word of the disappearance spread, theories began to emerge. Some suggested that the community had simply migrated to a new location, perhaps following caribou herds or responding to changing ice conditions. But this theory fell apart under scrutiny. Experienced Arctic travelers pointed out that such a large group moving across the tundra in winter would have left obvious tracks, and there were no reports of a community of this size appearing anywhere else in the region. Others proposed that disease might have struck the village, forcing survivors to abandon their homes. However, this explanation also had significant problems. If disease had been the cause, investigators would have expected to find bodies or at least evidence of graves. Moreover, healthy individuals would likely have taken essential supplies and freed the dogs rather than leaving them to die. More disturbing theories began to surface as the investigation continued. Some suggested that the disappearance might be connected to government activities in the region. The Canadian government had been actively involved in relocating Inuit communities during this period, sometimes moving entire populations to serve various political and economic interests. Could this have been a forced relocation that was later covered up? This theory gained some credence when researchers discovered that government records from the period were incomplete, with several documents related to Arctic communities mysteriously missing or heavily redacted. However, even forced government relocation wouldn't explain the scene LaBelle had discovered. Official relocations, however poorly planned, typically involved some advance notice and basic preparation. As months passed without any sign of the missing people, the case took on an almost supernatural quality in the public imagination. The story spread through newspapers across Canada and beyond, capturing the attention of people fascinated by unexplained mysteries. The remote location and extreme circumstances made verification difficult, allowing various embellished versions of the story to circulate. Some accounts claimed that the missing people numbered in the thousands, while others suggested that strange lights had been seen in the sky around the time of the disappearance. These elaborations, while dramatic, obscured the core mystery that investigators were trying to solve. Where had over 1,200 people gone, and why had they left behind everything necessary for survival in the Arctic? The investigation faced significant challenges from the beginning. The remote location meant that evidence collection was difficult and expensive. Weather conditions limited the time investigators could spend at the site. Perhaps most importantly, the lack of written records from the community itself meant that investigators had no baseline information about the residents, their normal patterns, or their social structure. What investigators did know painted a picture of a well-established, stable community. The village showed signs of permanent habitation, with substantial structures designed to withstand Arctic conditions. Tool-making areas, food storage facilities, and other infrastructure indicated a population that had been planning to remain in the location long-term, not a temporary camp that might be easily abandoned. As the case grew cold, various researchers and investigators continued to examine the available evidence. Some focused on the possibility that the disappearance had been misreported or exaggerated, suggesting that the community might have been smaller than initially claimed or that some residents had been away from the village when LaBelle arrived. However, these explanations still couldn't account for the fundamental questions raised by the physical evidence. Even if the numbers had been inflated, why would any Arctic community abandon their dogs to starve? Why would they leave essential survival equipment behind? Why would they depart in the middle of winter without any apparent preparation? Decades later, the Lake Angikuni case remains one of Canada's most puzzling missing persons investigations. Modern researchers have suggested various explanations, from mass migration triggered by changing environmental conditions to government actions that were never properly documented. Some have questioned whether the disappearance occurred exactly as reported, noting that details may have been altered or embellished over the years, yet the core mystery persists. Multiple witnesses confirmed the abandoned village scene. Official police reports documented the investigation. The story appeared in newspapers and government communications of the period. Something significant had occurred at Lake Angikuni, even if the exact details remain unclear. The case raises uncomfortable questions about how easily people can disappear, even in the modern era of communication and documentation. If over 1,000 people could vanish without trace in 1930, what does that say about our ability to protect and account for vulnerable populations? The Lake Angikuni disappearance reminds us that there are still vast areas of our world where people can simply cease to exist without explanation. Perhaps most chilling is the realization that we may never know what happened